Thanks, Rob. Can everyone hear me okay? The mics are on in the back and everything? All right. So this talk is about prospecting the security landscape with Spring Boot, Zuul, and Stormpath. And Rob asked us to do a talk about all of our Spring Boot integration that we've done at Stormpath. So what we're going to do here is just talk a little bit about it, and then we're going to do some demos. I'm going to do some basic demos, and then Micah will get up here and he'll do some more advanced demos. So my name is Matt Raible. I'm a hick from the sticks. I grew up in the backwoods of Montana with no electricity, no running water for 16 years. And I had to walk 2 miles to the bus stop every day, and it was uphill both ways. This is all a very true story. My parents actually retired there and built a new house that actually has indoor plumbing now, and so they don't have to wait for one of them to go to the outhouse to warm up the seat now, so that's nice. They're enjoying retirement up there. But the cabin I was born in, my sister was born in one corner, I was born in the other. I came out with my umbilical cord wrapped around my neck, and luckily the doctor, my dad with a hunting knife, was able to save my life, so glad to be here today. I work for a company called Stormpath, and we do users in the cloud. You could say users as a software service. The abbreviation for that is UAS, which isn't a very good abbreviation, so I like to say UMAS, users as a software service. You might also hear identity as a software service. That's another common term in the space. And basically, we offer a fast market. So instead of you writing authentication yourself, you can use us. You can drop in a few lines of code and basically have your authentication done for you. We support, just like Spring Security as authorities, you can develop groups in our system, and then those will come back as authorities. And we have full integration with just Spring MVC in general, or Spring Security, or if you just wanted to use servlets or Apache Shiro, basically a lot of the Java security frameworks we offer support for. You'll see all these different logos down here at the bottom. Those are all the SDKs that we have. So if you're doing Python, or you're doing Go, or Angular, or you're doing iOS, we offer SDKs for those. So basically, you should only have to write a few lines of code once you actually sign up for an account. And you get 10,000 free API requests a month. So as a developer, what I've noticed, me being a developer and using Stormpath's API, I go through about 12 or 15,000 a month, but I'm like hitting it all day, every day. And so it should work for you. And I haven't gotten any notifications that I'm actually going over the amount, so that's one of our secrets that we don't tell people. Oh, this is being recorded. Can you scratch that out? So we do have a limit, but we don't really enforce it too much. So to learn a little bit more about you, have you implemented your own authentication before? Raise your hands. Got about half the room. How long have you been using Spring? If you've been using it for more than 10 years, so this is like Spring 1.0, maybe 2.0. Okay, we got a few of you. How many have been using it for the last 5 years? Okay, it's most of the room. Has anyone not used it at all? Okay. Anyone just using it in the last year? Okay. And what about Spring Security? Hands for Spring Security? Let's take it way back. Who used the CG Security? We got a few of us. We'll have to toast for that later. How many people have heard of Stormpath? Got 5. Okay. Anyone customers? I can buy customers drinks. No? Has anyone tried it? Besides, obviously, the guys that work there. Rob's tried it. Worked out well for you? Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I tried it. The first time I tried it was actually 2 years before I joined the company. And you basically, what you do is you sign up for an account, you register, you put in basic information, and then you get these API keys that you download. You put them in a .stormpath directory in your home directory, and then you make requests to the APIs. And at the time, it was, as long as you followed the quick start guide, it worked pretty well. Since I've been working there, I've been there almost 6 months now, we've made it so simple with Spring Boot that all you have to do is drop in a dependency, and that's it, and it just works. So it's pretty sweet, and I'll show you a demo of that coming up. I'm also curious to see if anyone's used our competitors. Has anyone tried Auth2? You tried it? It wasn't as good, right? It's terrible. That's what I thought. What about Okta? Okta has like this API that, and what was your experience with that?
Yeah, those are words I shouldn't use in Mexico.
Anyone have a positive experience? Meh. It wasn't bad, but it still kind of stunk. Did you like it? It wasn't good?
Well, I wouldn't say it was bad. It was a lot to get up and running.
Right. It's kind of like, I don't know if anyone studied Angular a lot, but Angular in the last year, right, they released Angular 2, And their quick start guide used to be like 10 pages long last summer. And it was like, you create these 10 files, and you do all this stuff, and then at the end, you can actually, see a web page. And you're like, Angular used to be like 10 lines of code in a single page, and it would all just work. I didn't have to build it with Webpack or anything like that. And that's, I kind of think where Okta is, and they're like, you do these 20 steps, and then you could talk to our API. So we're doing pretty good in that space. So Spring Boot, how many people using Spring Boot? Anyone not using Spring Boot? Okay, so might be a little repetitive, but automatically configure Spring whenever possible. The big reason that I used it as a client a couple years ago, it was John Muir Health out in California, and what they needed is they just needed its externalized configuration. They were using Spring, and to use externalized configuration with Spring, right, you would make these different beans with different paths and use environment variables and stuff like that. But with Spring Boot, like, it just all worked out of the box. You could just put files in a different location, and those would automatically configure it. So that's when I started using it back in 2013. And it's got all those metrics and health checks, but they really wanted it for the externalized configuration. And since it was related to Spring, they were fine with just using it as a wrapper on top of it. The big detraction from the Spring community and from Spring in general was that they started out doing Spring Roo, and where you would generate a lot of the project and just have annotations on your entities. And Spring Boot was kind of a detraction from that, where they said, we're just going to give you a foundation like we did with Spring, and we're going to make it easy for you instead of requiring you to write a bunch of XML or generate code. And the big change from a lot of Java applications was the whole embedding Tomcat, Jetty, or Undertow. Spring Boot 1.5 came out a few weeks ago. It's got Apache Kafka support, some Cloud Foundry stuff. Anyone using Cloud Foundry? Got about 5. Anyone using Heroku? Got about 0. Well, we got 1. Mike is using it. AWS? We got about 5 more. Okay. Anyone affected by S3 yesterday? I was on a plane, so I was just giggling as I saw the tweets go across. Spring Data is the latest releases in there. LDAP support, which is kind of a big deal for a lot of customers. It's even a big deal that we've seen in the identity space, where customers actually want LDAP like endpoints, LDAP in the cloud, to be able to be a cloud customer. And then Loggers endpoint, and the big one for us was Spring Security 4.2. So I don't know if Rob's told you, but one of the extension points they added in Spring Security 4.2 was the ability to customize your own DSL. And so you could basically auto-configure your third-party dependency that we have in Stormpath. There's also a bunch of other new stuff, but one of the other things I like is in Spring Framework 4.3, they added constructor injection without having to do an auto-wired annotation. And so now your Java classes can look a lot cleaner that way. You don't have to have auto-wired in there. So getting started with Spring Boot is easy. You just use Spring Initializer, right? Start.spring.io. You can use it from a browser. You can use it from the command line, or even in IntelliJ. So in IntelliJ, there's an option where you can do, new project, and it's in there. How many people like Eclipse? Keep your hand up if you do web development. You do JavaScript in Eclipse? No, yeah. The big reason I switched to IntelliJ like 10 years ago was because of Maven, right? Like Eclipse didn't have good Maven support like back in 2006 at all, and I do a lot of web development, so IntelliJ is a little better than that. But Eclipse was my love for the first 5 years there. So at Stormpath, we have a lot of experience with Spring Boot. Last year, we migrated our microservices architecture to Spring Boot. We took about 3 weeks to do that. So it was a traditional Spring app secured with Apache Shiro and configured with both XML and Java config. And when we added Spring Boot, it didn't replace Spring, but it simplified much of our architecture by adding a layer that helped automate configuration and deployment while making it easier to implement features. And so we also built some custom Spring Boot starters for that. You'll see one of them with our Zulu integration, and also another one is a real-time stream messaging with Apache Samza. So Samza used to require that you would basically use their quick start that took 2 or 3 pages to get through, and we created a Spring Boot starter for it, so now you can just drop in the dependency and it works. So that was really nice. So a lot of XML config to Java config, which wasn't really Spring Boot, but the nice thing was config files are supposed to be in a certain location, so that was good for us, and then all the auto configuration stuff. So Stormpath's REST API is very easy to talk to. Here's an example with curl. You can see that you pass in your API key and secret, which would be in that .stormpath directory and an API key.properties file. and then you pass in that you want application JSON to be returned. You give an endpoint, whether that's your applications or your accounts or whatever, and then the data that you want to basically send it. So this is how you create a new user account with our API. And what we found is in the first couple years that we existed, we basically started 5 years ago, and we just had an API in the beginning. And all our documentation was like, here's how you talk to our API. And while that worked, people didn't really want to write HTTP code. They wanted to write Java code, or they wanted to write Python code. And so what we found was a pivot point in the company about 3 years ago where we started writing SDKs for the API in all these different languages. So, for example, to look at the Java SDK, this is how you would do it. You'd basically create a new account object, and then you set the properties, and then you create the account. So if you're a Java developer, this looks much easier than that curl command. And basically, this really took off for us. And a lot of people started using it, and some SDKs are more thorough than others, and our Java one is our most popular, and our Spring is by far the most popular in the Java version. And if you look at our SDK on GitHub, basically we separate it out just like most projects do, where we have an API project, and that is not allowed to change between releases because we use semantic versioning. So we're still at 1.x and 2.x. When we want to go there, it means we're changing things in our API. Our impl package is the implementation. We can change whatever we want in there between minor releases, but not in major releases. So how the actual stack looks is we have a servlet stack. And so if you want to just do servlets, anyone doing plain servlets? Nobody anymore, right? So it was 5 years ago when they developed that. And then Spring and Web. And for Spring, we have a number of different ones. We have Spring Security. We have plain just Stormpath Spring. And then if you're using Spring with the web, and then if you're with Boot, and if you're using Timeleaf. And so what we found, we only found this out probably, what was it, 2 months ago? When we started to, actually we started 6 months ago with our 1.0 release trying to get on start.spring.io. And it wasn't until Spring 1.5 where we had the Spring Security 4.2 stuff where we were actually ready to go, and they were like, okay, we'll accept you. You can come on board now. We had 8 Spring Boot starters. And what we're trying to do is basically get a couple of them on there, right? The Zuul starter, Stormpath default Spring Boot starter. And talking with Spring guys, it was great because what they told us was like, all the other products out there have one. And even though there's 8 different products within that one, or 8 different features like we have, there's annotations within Spring, and there's a way of detecting things in the class path and stuff like that with conditional on being that you can basically enable things based on that. And so now we still have our basic, just a Stormpath Spring Boot starter on there, but we know that we could put all different features, all 8 features on there, all different of our starters, just by being a little more clever with the class path and what we detect. So if you wanted to build a standalone Spring Java application, you could just use Stormpath Java, and it's our core SDK, and you'd be basically writing code like you saw before to create an account, and you wouldn't actually be handling a web request or anything like that. If you wanted to do a servlet, you could do it in our servlet environment. If you want to do Spring Web MVC, the difference basically with Spring Security and Spring Web MVC is Spring Security locks down everything by default, right? Spring Web MVC is a little bit different. With Spring Security, you configure it for Stormpath just like you configure it for Spring Security. We just handled getting the user object and hydrating that from our service instead of Spring Security doing it from its data store. So you can learn more. I wrote this blog post last November that basically talks about all the internals, the data model, the operation of executions that happen in the background, and the caching that we do to make it faster on the actual SDK, and then the builder pattern that we use, how you configure everything, and how we do OAuth2 workflows. So you can read all that. We're going to publish these slides probably later tonight or tomorrow, and then you can click on this and it'll take you to the blog post. So we support a number of different authentication mechanisms, just like Spring Security. Username and password, basic authentication. If you pass in an authentication header, there's OAuth2 workflows. So hitting like API auth token or OAuth token, and then OAuth revoke, so you get those tokens back and you can store them on your client. We also offer a new feature that just came out last month, which is Client API. So you actually don't have to have a server-side integration. You can just go directly from like your Angular client right to our API and get tokens. And then you could pass those tokens back to your server if you would like. and you could do just JOT verification there, where it verifies that it's not expired or anything like that, or you could put our SDK into there and actually talk back to the server and do like full authentication. So one of the things that I didn't know before when I started at Stormpath was JWTs is pronounced JOT. Kind of funny, right? Weird, because GWTs is GWT, right? I don't know why they got JOT, but it's actually in the specification for JWTs as like JOT. We're also working on OpenID Connect. That is in our main REST API, but we don't have support for it in our SDK, so we're working on that now, and hopefully that'll be out next month or in April. And then multi-factor authentication, which Mike is going to do a demo for, and if the demo gods cooperate, hopefully you'll be impressed. We also offer custom data search and custom data, so you can tweak it so when someone signs up, you can save custom data along with the user's information, and we support up to 10 megabytes per user, and then you can also search all that data, and we use Elasticsearch in the back end and some fancy algorithm to do all that. So now I'm going to do a demo of just Spring Boot with Spring Security and Stormpath, and hopefully this will be pretty quick and easy. And if I forget to mirror things, then let me know, because sometimes I do talk, and I don't see it up there, and I see everything here, and you guys are like, what's he talking about? So we'll close all these down here. Then I also have an integration of Stormpath with JHipster 4. Anyone using JHipster? Okay, we get to skip that part. Look, he just saved like 10 minutes. Do you want to see that demo? He's like, nope. Okay. But I just wrote that on the plane, so it's pretty cool. So I have an alias here that's pretty cool. You can do boot Stormpath, and it basically downloads, creates a project, and runs everything, right, in 1.4 seconds. And then it goes and talks to Stormpath, and it takes 6 more seconds. So that's pretty cool. I'll just show you the alias. It's this one right here. It curls start.spring.io. It grabs dependencies is just Stormpath, and then it boots it up. So Micah wrote this one-liner. It's kind of cool. I just like to show it off. But this is the one I'm going to show you, this start Stormpath one, which basically gets Data JPA, Data REST, H2, Spring Web, and DevTools, and Spring Security, and then Stormpath. And since Stormpath does have Spring Security in there by default, I don't need security, but I want to show you how basically authentication works without Stormpath, and then show you how it works with it. So we'll run that, and that downloads a demo.zip. So we'll open that. We'll go into that directory. Open it up in IntelliJ. So obviously there's not much in it. You guys have probably all done this with start.spring.io. There's just a single class in there. I'll make the font a little bigger here so you can see it in the back. Okay, and then in the pom.xml, the things that we specifically add for Stormpath are the Stormpath Default Spring Boot Starter. Oh, didn't get it all. No auto import. And this BOM down here, bill of materials, right? This is something that people have started doing with their Maven projects recently. And this is one of the things that we had to do to get on start.spring.io. So if you're developing a Spring Boot starter and you want to get on there, they're going to force you to have one of these that basically locks down all the versions of your dependencies that you're dependent on. So we're just importing it here. It's not going to make a difference whether I comment that or not. So if we were to run this project, we could run it up here. I just want to show you, there is links in the slide at the end, but this is all in a presentation that I have, or in a demo that I have, that's Spring Boot, and then it's written in ASCII Doctor here, so it shows like all the different things that we're going to do. So if we just look at it, localhost 8080, it requires a username and password by default, right? This is because you have Spring Security in there, so you're like, user, that should work. No, it doesn't work because you gotta like go in here and be like, grab that guy right there. But there's also this weird thing that's been happening to me recently. You notice that it just keeps restarting? So to solve that, you gotta be like, DevTools, you're cool, but you're not that cool. I don't know why. Like half the time it works fine, the other half the time it keeps restarting. So yeah, I'll take that. Right, usually like when I practice it, it does this, and then when I get on stage it doesn't. I'm like, yeah, that's cool. But at least I had similar experiences. Right? So it prints out the default security password right here, right? And so you got to grab that. This is just the default behavior if you don't configure everything. And then you can basically see, you know, because we're using Spring Data REST, it comes up with this. If you're not using Spring Data REST, the default endpoint is a 404 not found error. And so that's, you know, maybe a Spring Boot flaw, but not really because, you know, it just doesn't generate anything for you. So the one thing you can do if you want to change that is, you know, security and then user password equals like user, right? And then you restart it, and then you can put user in there. So to build the application up, we'll do an entity, which is we'll call blog. And you can see there it's got a generated value, and a name, and a string name. And then to persist it, you can have a repository, and thanks to Spring Data JPA, you can extend a JPA repository, and it gives you all the CRUD stuff, right? Pretty easy. If you want to do a REST controller, or just expose this as an anemic domain model, then there's a, I think it's REST resource. Repository REST resource, you can do that. And now that endpoint blogs is available. You can CRUD against it. ThoughtWorks Radar came out in November last year, and they said any model's on the hold, right? So even though you can do it, they're not recommending it anymore. But it's great for demos, right? It's cool to say, hey, look, I wrote 10 lines of code, and now I can, you know, CRUD this whole REST API. The next thing is a command line runner, just to show you that the data is actually there. So you see here it uses the new stuff in Spring 4.3 where it has that no auto-wired annotation, and it's just going to print all of our blogs out. And then in this directory, I'm going to create a data.sql file and basically just enter, you know, some basic values into the blog table. The one thing I did want to note here is that, come on, Spring. Tabs, still. I choose spaces. Who uses tabs still? Okay, wrong room. Sorry. Lots of tabs here. I mean, it is one character versus 4, so maybe it's optimized, but we're not doing JavaScript here. They're all wrong. Okay, so now if we restart, we should see those 2 entries at least printed out. So there they are. They made it into our database, and then we can create a controller that basically exposes those at, we could do the main endpoint, but I'll do it at blogs, and just gets them for all those repositories. So if DevTools work like it does in Eclipse, then that would automatically refresh for me. And we could go up here, and we could do blogs, and we should be able to do user. So there we go. You know, pretty simple. We're able to write a REST endpoint and 95 lines of code and credit it. So if we want to add Stormpath back in, we can basically uncomment this, restart it. Oh, I did? See, that's why I like to pair program. Back here. Okay. Thank you. So what we do is the same thing as Spring Security. We lock down everything by default. So if you were to go to localhost 8080 blogs, then it wouldn't work. No, it's going to work. Come on. The one thing that we have noticed, we've been told by the Spring guys, is we do initialize kind of late in the game versus early in the game. So it does have to go out to Stormpath and like gather everything up and figure out what your application is. Okay, so we still have basic authentication. Close your browser, reopen it. So we provide timely templates by default. I don't need a new printer. So it locks everything down, and then it serves up HTML, right? But the cool thing is, if you're using a different source, for instance, an AJAX client, when it goes and gets that login endpoint, it basically brings back all your social login endpoints as well as the form fields to build the form. So for our Angular SDKs, for our React SDKs, those actually talk to the same login endpoint, but they get JSON back, and then they build up their form. For this one, it knows that it's, accept text HTML, so it brings back the timely template. And then if I use a pre-configured username that I have here that I've already set up in Stormpath, then I can log in. And Mike added this a couple weeks ago where instead of providing, hey, you don't have a login page and there's an error after you log in, we now provide a way that you can actually log out, right? It just gives you a button so you can do that. What we do by default is we have cookies. So if you were to look in, the browser tab and look under cookies, you would see that we have an access token. That's basically a JOT, and then a refresh token. And so this uses some of the OAuth2 concepts, even though we're hitting like a login endpoint instead of the OAuth token endpoint. And what happens is when you log in, we can show what it looks like in here. Clear that. Then I'll use my one password. Sometimes faster. So it makes that login next request. I can't see it here, but it sets those cookies, and then when you log out, it clears them. They're HTTP-only cookies, and so you can't actually get to them from JavaScript. And that's why if you need to do like a JavaScript client that talks to OAuth token, that's how you get like the token back and actually store it in local storage, or you could do it in a cookie as well. So our Angular SDK at Stormpath SDK Angular, we have an AngularJS one, and we have an Angular one. I like the Angular one because I helped with it. But AngularJS works okay, but ThoughtWorks said it was a legacy technology and not to start new projects with it. So our Angular one basically stores everything in local storage, and you can see here that it just requires like this tag pretty much, but if you want to show that someone actually logged in, then you would show that. So that's basically an overview of our Spring Boot support, just the basic support, and Mike is going to do a more advanced demo of actually doing it with Zuul. And Zuul is like a gateway, right? You have a microservices architecture, you have Zuul on the front end as a gateway, you have all your microservices in the back end. And so one of the things that I've seen with doing JHipster is, even though, or even just Spring Eureka servers and clients that discover it, is most of the time those back-end services are actually in a DMZ or something like that, so they don't need to be protected. But we have a way that you can actually protect those as well using Spring Security in this library that we have called Juiser. Anyone interested in seeing this deployed to Cloud Foundry, or you're good enough? All right, so we'll take probably a 3 or 4 minute break. To deploy to Cloud Foundry, all you have to do is package it in CF push. Pretty easy, right? Point it to the jar, and it all just works. As far as Stormpath, configuring that on Cloud Foundry, you have to set some environment variables for our API key and for our secret, and then you also have to force HTTPS. One of the things I found is if you deploy it HTTP and you access the site over HTTP, the communication to Stormpath, we don't allow that. We basically say, hey, that's not going to work. So you do have to set it to explicitly HTTPS, which you could do on Cloud Foundry and force it. So it's 7:06 now. We'll come back at 7:10, maybe 7:12, and we'll have Micah start up.
There's a whole lot of pizza if anybody wants.
And I can take questions in the meantime while he's setting up. So, yeah. We do not have Polymer, but one of the things we started to do is we saw that we had all these different SDKs for like React and Angular and AngularJS, and it's kind of a pain to maintain all those. So one of the things that we did last month is we released a widget that's plain JavaScript, and it's small in like 20K or 25K. And our idea there is we're going to create light wrappers for like Polymer and for Angular and for React that basically don't require a whole lot of code to make things work, right? And you can just say basically use this widget here, configure it, maybe in Angular, and then we can use the same foundation for everything. Anyone else? Well, the last thing I would say for my portion is I didn't bring any Stormpath stickers because we were at Dev Nexus last week and we ran out, but I got Devoxx US stickers. I got business cards. That's it. So if you want to come up, they're up here.
Easy on the swag, man.
Right. I'll give you my shirt, but that'd be awkward. Yeah. Uh-huh. So Azure is like Heroku, right, or Google Cloud. Like it's its whole like cloud provider, and it has authentication, right? And Amazon now has, I forget the name of their tool, right? But it's similar. We call them a competitor as well, which they have an authentication system in the cloud that they can protect everything.
Is that Cognito?
Cognito, right? AWS Cognito. The only thing I would say is we're probably more developer friendly, right? But I haven't tried it out. If you talk to Lee, he's more of a .NET guy, so he might have some insight into that. Yep, so we support all that, and as well as we support getting it back out, right? So we don't control your data. You can export it at any time, and we'll help you with that. So the basic idea is we'll make it very easy to do. We do require that your data is on, right, our platform and in our cloud, and we have had some interest in, like, bring your own directory, right, where we actually talk to an existing directory, but I think we only really need that for, like, huge customers that are on like Google directory or something like that. So we haven't really investigated that much yet. Anyone else? All right.
So we'll get going again, at 7:15?
Sure, that's good.
All right, everybody. Welcome back. My name is Micah Silverman, and I get to work with Matt and with Lee up over there. And just by way of introductions, I'm a little older than most people tend to be in the audience. So I graduated college in 1990 and had 5 long, dark years before Java was released. I was doing mainly C programming. Around 1995, I started doing some web and Perl programming, very early stuff, some CGI programming, and I was part of the team that launched the Sci-Fi Channel's very first website, and it was hosted on a little Sun pizza box, sitting on a desk in a common room connected to a 56K line. So there it is. I tend to say get off my lawn a lot, as Matt and Lee can attest to, but so I've been doing Java a long time. When it came out in 1995, I went to a meetup that, it wasn't even called a meetup then, but a gathering hosted by Sun where they were introducing this language that was going to totally replace Flash on the desktop. AWT for the win. And thank God that actually didn't happen, because AWT and, I don't know, depends on where you land, but Swing, they're kind of terrible. JavaFX is pretty good. But, soon thereafter, by, 97 or 98, it was all about the server, the first version of Servlet, the first version of EJB, which Sun got terribly wrong and really created the space for Spring and Hibernate and all the tools while people were waiting for Java Enterprise Edition to really get it together. Spring and Hibernate emerged and just kind of took over, also thankfully. So I have the distinction of having co-written, I should say, a book on EJB 3.0, which is when Sun really finally got EJB right, and they released it just in time to become pretty irrelevant, because by then Hibernate and Spring had really kind of taken root, and you really didn't need to go and pay a $4,000 license fee, WebSphere, just to be able to use EJB3. You could just go and grab Spring and Hibernate and annotations were out, so everything just worked the way, it was kind of the vision of EJB realized. So I do have to my credit having co-authored a book, but it was just in time for it to be completely irrelevant. But it's still for sale on Amazon, so if you ever need to hold a door open, you know where to find it. So what I'm going to talk to you about is a little bit of, we're going to introduce Zuul a little bit and talk its relevance in the context of authentication. Happens to be that I'm going to show you some Stormpath goodies, but it really could apply to any situation where you want to have authentication and authorization happen at an edge service or a gateway and push it back from your application servers. We're going to take a little detour into the world of JOTs that Matt introduced, but I'm going to go into a little more depth about JOTs. And then I'm just going to show you a little example where I started with a Spring Boot MFA example using Stormpath, and I pushed that into Zuul kind of as a thought experiment to see how easy it was, and it wasn't too bad. So by way of introduction, how many people are familiar with Zuul, with Spring Cloud? Got one in the back. Okay, got some more. Yeah, so there's a lot that Zuul does. What we're going to focus on primarily is its function as a gateway routing service. So it does other things like service discovery with Eureka. We're not going to look at that exactly tonight, but it does. If you've ever used Node.js, I mean, at least to me, just kind of being a newcomer to the world of Zuul, when you can drop a bunch of routing rules in a properties file, like a YAML file, it reminds me a little more of Express, and it makes Java a little more civilized. Spring Boot is amazing in that you just have an annotation and you set up your request mapping. This pushes it even further back, and it's purely config. So the idea, and we actually got some feedback from a bunch of our customers, that one scenario is you have a customer that has already created a bunch of microservices, or they already have an API that they expose, and maybe that represents tens or hundreds of services or edge locations on their network, and now they want to offload off to something. Could be pure Spring Security, it could be Stormpath, could be Okta. Now, rather than having to drop in dependencies into each of these little microservice projects that are potentially managed by different teams, it would be better to have a central location that all authentication flowed through, and then once authenticated, it could pass forward an assertion that all these other microservices trusted to say, this person is actually authenticated. So now the job of the microservice, there's no new dependencies, very few new dependencies that need to be added to the microservice. It just needs to interpret this incoming assertion. So in our case, rather than having to drop in a Stormpath dependency on a bunch of these microservices, maybe you only have to drop in a JWT dependency because that's how the assertion is coming in, and then your job is just to interpret that incoming JWT, to be able to parse it and to be able to react to it to know that the user's authenticated. So the idea is to kind of push that responsibility out to the gateway. So we have two projects that are kind of companions of each other, and I'll switch to them in just a second. The first one is, it's part of the Java SDK from Stormpath. We have it organized in such a way that you can see all of these extensions that we provide on top of the basic SDK. So if I look here, I'll just show you this really quick. So as Matt said, we have the API and the impl. That's the foundation of everything. We separated those so that we can change around the guts. As long as you're using, basically to get started with Stormpath, you would just have the API as a compile time dependency, impl as a runtime dependency, and as long as you stick to that, we can change around the guts and release, and we do everything by Semver, and you won't have to change your code. But then we have all these extensions that are integrations. And Zuul is one of them. So we have this Zuul extension, and basically the idea is if you drop this Zuul extension, represented as a Maven dependency into your project, you now have Zuul. Not only do you have Zuul as a Spring Boot application, but you now also have Stormpath integrated into it, which means without any additional coding on your part, you get, login and OAuth2 and forgot my password and all of those nice time leaf templates that Matt was talking about out of the box. I'm going to show you that in just a second. The companion to that, so we wanted to also represent the other side of this. And we set this up as its own organization because it's not really a Stormpath thing. But once you get past the gateway to what you would call your origin server, that's the thing that's actually your application, you now have this header that's coming in with the JOT that represents the authentication assertion, and we didn't want to just leave people that were trying this out high and dry. So we came up with this Juiser organization and a Juiser project. It stands for Java User something or other.
Remember the Google library?
Yeah, that's right. So no confusion there. Yeah, so it's Java, Juice, and User, right? So it gives you the juice to deal with these authenticated users is the idea. But this is the other side of the equation, and by the way, anybody familiar with Les Hazelwood? He's the CTO of Stormpath. He does a lot of talking. He wrote all of this, so it's pretty impressive. But the idea here is that this is a Spring Boot and Spring Security compliant drop-in, if you will. And what it means is that it can ingest and create a Spring Security principal that is then available to Spring Security, and as far as Spring Boot and Spring Security are concerned, you're authenticated. And at that point, you can just use the normal Spring Security constructs, things like pre-authorize, has permission, has role, etc. So Juicer is like the other side, and within the Juicer organization, Juicer is the main project, but then within the Juicer organization, there's a Juicer Spring Origin example. So it doesn't have to be Spring and Spring Boot. Really, at its core, it's a JWT processor, but the Spring Boot part of it then ultimately creates a user object out of this JWT that it just processed. So what I want to show you first is just the simplest possible example in action. And what that looks like is this is the Juicer Spring Origin example. So this with very little configuration knows how to ingest the incoming assertion. Really, this is mainly set up by configuration. And so really the only thing that it needs to know is a public key to be able to verify the signature on the incoming JOT. And we're going to get into some JOT details in just a minute, but the idea is that you don't want your origin server to just trust any old assertion. And you can put things in place, and typically you would, like your origin server will only accept incoming requests from the Zulu Gateway. But even with that, you now have a signed JOT. It's one of the powerful things about JWT, and you can verify that it came from your gateway server, your Zuul server. So if you ever had some kind of breach or had a man-in-the-middle attack, unless they have a hold of the private key that signed that JWT, it's going to blow up. The user won't be authenticated. So that's the origin server side of things. If we look at the Zulu Gateway side of things, so first of all, you'll notice that we basically, aside from Spring Boot Starter Test, we have one other dependency, and that's just the Stormpath Zuul Spring Cloud Starter. That's the only dependency that we need. And this also is managed a lot by configuration as opposed to code. So first of all, you can see here's the matching private key that is going to be used to sign. And the default behavior of the Stormpath extension here is that it's going to use JOTs and they're going to be signed JOTs. All of that can be overridden. You can also override what is going to be included in that JOT. By default, it's everything that we have on the user, basically. Once the user authenticates, what gets encoded into that JOT is going to be, all of their identifying information, their name, their full name, their email address, if they belong to any group. Stormpath has a thing called custom data. That's just free-form JSON data that's associated with an account. If that user that authenticated has any custom data, that's going to be jammed into the JOT. All of that is configurable and overridable, but this is like the simplest thing that'll work, right? So basically, the stuff at the top here that is Zuul specific. So we're saying that for any path, any incoming request, we're going to forward to this localhost 8080, kind of ant matcher style path there. And then for the Stormpath side of the configuration, we're just saying that here's our private key. And because this is Spring Security and by default everything is going to be locked down, the only thing that we have here is that we're applying Stormpath. And in the latest version, as Matt was saying, you don't even need that anymore. It'll auto-load the Stormpath configuration for Spring Security. But in this case, it's still there. So when we fire this up, that means that everything's going to be locked down by default. So Zuul is going to serve the authentication pages, which we'll see in a second. Then once you authenticate, because of this configuration, it's going to forward to localhost 8080. What's running on localhost 8080 is Juiser. Juicer is going to ingest that incoming JOT and set it up as a user with Spring Security. All right, so I already have Juicer running. Let's fire up this Zulu Demo. And one of the things that I did here while it's firing up is that I turned on, I kicked up the debug level on Apache HTTP headers. The reason that I did that is because I wanted to be able to easily show you the JOT that's getting forwarded in a header that by default is X forwarded user. And it's one of the things that can be a little confusing when you're first working with gateways. It's completely hidden from the browser. From the perspective of the end user, they're hitting an endpoint, they're logging into a page, and they're seeing a result. And if you were to turn on the dev inspector tools and look at all the traffic going by, you would never see this header that gets forwarded because that's something that happens behind the scenes. It's something that the browser is never exposed to. So by kicking up the logger level, we'll be able to see that header in the log output here. All right, so if I go to localhost 8000, that's where my Zuul is running. And if you notice, right away I'm redirected to login because everything's locked down, and that's what we would expect to happen. So now I'm going to log in. Okay, and now this page is served by Juicer. And so the important thing to note here is it knows who I am. Juicer knows who I am. How does it know that? We're going to look at that in just a second. Here's some of those details I was telling you. In Stormpath, objects of any kind, including user accounts, are identified by a unique href. So it knows the href really is the representation of me. Sure, the email is unique, but Stormpath supports multi-tenancy. So you could have the same email in different tenants. Really, the href is always what uniquely identifies it. And then it's got some other stuff all coming in from that user JOT that it's been able to parse. So if we jump back over to here, we can see we got a whole bunch of headers coming in. Let's look for that one particular one, our X forwarded user, right here. Okay? So this long, ugly, gnarly string, that is a JOT. And first I'm going to show you what's in that JOT. We have this handy little tool here called JSON Web Token IO. You can come here and you can paste a JOT in. You'll notice this one's, it's a pretty beefy JOT. This is what's in that JOT. This is the payload of that JOT, and it's just free-form JSON. So JWT is JSON Web Token, and you can see that any valid JSON can be stuffed into here. So, like we have this custom data, which itself is another JSON object, and it's got some stuff in it. You can have arrays, you can have booleans, anything that works for JSON will work inside a JOT. Here, it happens to be empty, but here's an example of an array contained inside another object. Okay, so now let's just take a step back and talk about JOTs a little bit. So one of the things that makes this work and makes it easily valuable is that these JOTs are all signed. In this case, it's signed with a private key, and then we're using the public key to verify it. And because it's signed, you have a high degree of confidence that it hasn't been tampered with. So one of the important things, let's see, just as a for instance, we have an issued at. We could also, that's what IAT stands for. We could also have an EXP. In the world of JOTs, these are called claims. The key value pairs, the key is called a claim. So an EXP claim says when this JOT expires, and any spec compliant parser has to respect that expiration. So there's no extra coding that you have to do. If you have a spec compliant parser and there's an EXP claim and it's expired, that parser is required to blow up. But if you didn't have a high degree of confidence that it hadn't been tampered with, then, what good is the EXP claim if anybody can mess around with it? So first of all, RFC 7519, that is the JWT specification. There are 7 of these what are called registered claims. So these are claims that they're essentially keywords, right? You can't use them for alternate purposes, and the specification talks about what their values have to be. So in some cases it's going to be an epoch time, in some cases it's going to be a string, but those 7 are kind of reserved. And then as Matt was saying earlier, just in case, they actually built it into the spec that it should be referred to as JOT. I forget all the time. I just call them JWTs, same thing, but there it is, JOT. Okay, so I want to talk briefly here about how the signature is computed, and then we'll talk about a couple of anti-patterns that go along with JWT signatures. How many people have worked directly with JOTs so far, just in passing in their career? All right, maybe a quarter of the crowd. So the secret is, the signature rather is, and there's a bunch. I think there's something like 12 different signing algorithms that you can do. One of them is shared secret, which is what this pseudocode up on the board is talking about. The example of Zuul communicating with Juiser uses private key, public key. But how you compute the signature is, in this case, you have a shared secret. And the important thing is that you take the header and the payload together, and then you take a binary byte array, whether it's a shared secret or a key, and you pass those 3 bits of information, the header, the payload, and the binary byte array, through an algorithm. And that gives you a base 64 encoded signature, which is the last piece of a JWT. So if we go back over here, if you may have noticed that there are 3 parts to the JWT. This first part is the header, and that contains things like the algorithm that's used. That can be, in this case, it's RS-256. That's going to be public key, private key. There's also HS, which is HMAC over SHA. This middle section is the body, and these first 2 sections, there's nothing special about them, and it's an important distinction. They're not encrypted. So anything that you're comfortable with passing essentially as plain text is what you would put into a JWT, even a signed JWT. The specification does also include encryption, But in the context of what we're talking about here, these are not encrypted. So it's something to be careful about. If you're using JOTs on the public internet, you have to make sure that it's not sensitive information unless you're actually encrypting it. This final section, this is the signature. That's what was computed using this mode here, right? So the signature is put together using the existing header and payload, and that's one of the things that ensures that it can't be tampered with. That you're not going to, so when you verify the signature, you're not going to come up with the same value if the header and payload has been tampered anyway. So that brings us to some secret anti-patterns. When you're using a shared secret, it's, you might argue, inherently less secure than something like public key, private key, or I should say it has its own challenges, right? With public key, private key, you have to make sure that the private key is kept private. If you do that, you have a high degree of confidence that everything's safe. With a shared secret, you have to keep that shared secret private, and there's more places that it needs to be protected, right? Because it's shared. So there are a couple of anti-patterns associated with shared secret in particular. One, and I gave them names so that you would remember them. Oh, it looks like we only got one of them in here. That's okay. Hold on. Nobody panic. We're going to go right over to here. And how do I, let's see. Present, thank you. Nice. All right, here we are. All right, so the first one is short but not sweet. So there are two main problems here, maybe three. So first of all, the word secret is a dictionary word. It's just a bad idea to use as a shared secret. Second of all, it's super short. The algorithm HS256 can handle a much wider secret, and the general rule of thumb is you want to use the widest byte array that makes sense for the algorithm that you're using. And then finally, it kind of goes along with the first issue, is that this is not a native byte array, it's a dictionary term. We're getting its bytes and making it into a byte array, but you really want to work with long, random byte arrays that fit the algorithm that you're using. So a couple of problems there, short but not sweet. The next one is you're doing it wrong. So if you look at the top, we have a nice long base 64 encoded secret. You can take my word for it that when you convert that back into, when you decode this to its binary byte array, it is the right width for HS256. So that's good. So can anybody spot the problem here? Why I say you're doing it wrong? And this is actual Java code that you would use with the Java JWT library. So the problem here is that we're not actually decoding it. We're taking this string and we're converting it into bytes, as opposed to decoding it into its binary byte array representation. So this is a base 64 encoded secret. That's fine. Us humans need to deal with strings. You know, it's hard for us to look at binary byte arrays and make any sense of them. But we don't want to just call get bytes. We actually want to use a base 64 decoder and decode this string into its native binary byte array. So that brings us to the last one that I call supersize that secret. So here, just in case you were curious, this is the right way. We're doing the right thing here, right? We're not just calling get bytes. We're actually decoding that encoded string to its binary byte array. So if you're going to do any of these anti-patterns, this one is the most safe. Anybody spot what might be wrong with this one? So this one is using HS512. HS512 can handle a much wider secret than HS256. So the only thing really that's wrong with this is that our secret could be a lot longer. So of all the three, this one is the least offensive, or gives you the least amount of exposure, but it could be made even stronger by having a wider byte array. We have another site, and I have references at the end, and we'll make sure that you get all of them. But this one is specific to Java. And what it does, if you notice, the upper right here is the only one that has a green header. That's the editable quadrant, if you will. And what it does is when you mess around with the header and the payload, it will give you the builder and parser using the Java JWT library that you would use to actually work with this bit of JSON to encode. It also gives you the actual JOT. One of the things to notice here is it uses a secure random key. So it starts that way, and I can just generate a new one, and you see in the upper left, it's impacting the JOT, right? It's changing the signature. Notice the first two sections aren't changing at all because I haven't changed anything in those sections. But every time I generate a new shared secret, it's going to generate a new signature. Now, if I change the algorithm, let's say to, also it gives you feedback if you have invalid stuff in there. If I change the algorithm, say to HS512, notice now that the secure key that it's generating is much wider than HS256, right? So that's what I mean in that last anti-pattern, that you always want to pick a key whose width is matches the algorithm that you're using. And by the way, with the Java JWT, you can never have a secret that's too long, because if it is too long for the algorithm that you're using, it just wraps around. So you're kind of wasting bytes, but it doesn't hurt anything to have a long key. So err on the side of a long key. Anyway, this is a handy website if you want to see what's going on and you want to get a sense of how the Java JWT works. All right. Everybody take a deep breath. I'm going to pause for a second and ask if there's any questions about what we've looked at so far with Zuul, Juiser, or JOTs. And then in the last 10 minutes or so, I'm going to show you the MFA example. Any questions? All right. Lots of good resources at the end. Okay, so a little while ago, I came up with a Spring Boot MFA, because one of the things that Stormpath does to make your life easier is it gives you SMS and Google Authenticator MFA out of the box, so you don't have to do a lot of coding to take advantage of that. And I made a little Spring Boot example with one flow that people might be interested in, one use case of MFA. MFA is multi-factor authentication. Everybody familiar with it? Anybody not familiar with it? So it's basically, instead of just username and password, which is something you know, multi-factor also adds something that you have. So in the old days, it used to be like this RSA token that you'd carry around. It was like a sealed thing. It had a little display. It showed numbers that changed every 60 seconds or so. It was like, a big patented breakthrough in security technology. And then when those patents expired, lots of people jumped on the bandwagon and made it a lot more accessible to people like you and me to do MFA. So now you have things like Google Authenticator, where on your smartphone, that's now the thing you have. So in addition to what you know, your password, you have the second factor, which is the thing that you have. So this particular use case, there are a lot of different flows that you can implement, and if you've ever used a site that makes use of MFA or two-factor authentication, there's different ways that you can do it. Some sites will have you put in that second factor every single time you log in. AWS does that if you've enabled two-factor. Some sites, there might even be a checkbox like, don't bother me with MFA for the next 30 days on this machine. I wanted to keep it simple, so this particular flow that I implemented does the Amazon thing. Every single time you log in, you have to put in that second factor. If you've never done it before, one of the innovations that Google Authenticator did is you used to have to enter the shared secret manually. And it could be this long, gnarly, ugly. There were all kinds of insecure ways of getting that shared secret to you. What Google Authenticator did is that they convert that shared secret into a QR code, which all of the Google Authenticator compatible MFA apps can just scan with your phone's camera. It makes it a lot more civilized. So don't be scared by this flow chart here. It looks more complex than it is. Let me see if I can make it a little smaller, and then I'll zoom in on it. Okay, so the easiest way to look at it is to split it down the middle, and there's a right side flow and a left side flow. Basically, it says, here we go. So basically, we're going to come in the front door here, and it's going to look and see if we're already authenticated. So if we're not already authenticated, then we're going to hit login. Assuming login is successful, it's going to check and see if MFA is even set up. Like, have we scanned that QR code yet? If not, then we're going to set it up. It's going to show us the QR, we can scan it, now we're all set up. If it is already set up, we enter the code, and then if the code is valid, we're all good. Okay? The left side here is to cover a little bit of an edge case where, let's say you've already authenticated, but you skipped putting in the 2FA. Like, I authenticate, I'm at the screen where it wants me to put in the code, and then I close that tab. Well, like Matt showed you earlier, I have the cookie set in my browser. I've already authenticated, but I never validated the latest code. So that's what this left side is for, in case you're trying to do something sneaky or you just closed your browser tab. So if I'm already authenticated, like the cookies are already present, then I go to the left side of this flow. Is MFA already set up? If it is already set up, then is there an existing challenge? If not, that means that I already entered MFA after I logged in, and I can just go to the home page. If there is not an existing challenge, then I go back to this right side of the flow where I have to enter the code and do the MFA thing. So if that's not clear, don't worry about it. This is an open source GitHub project. It'll be included in the list of things that we show you, and you can easily get going with it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to kill the super simple Zuul demo. And by the way, I didn't show you this before, but there's basically 3 relevant files in the most simple Zuul, and some of them, and the first 2, the demo application and the Spring Security Web App config, those are basically just boilerplate, right? The demo application is just, typical Spring Boot startup, and then Spring Security Web App config is to apply Stormpath. The Zuul extension is a little bit behind the rest of our stack, so at this moment you still do have to apply Stormpath. Once we update it to the latest version, you won't even need the Spring Security Web App config file anymore if you're doing like a totally default setup. And then the third file, the one that is really where things kick in, is the configuration. So in the Zuul MFA example, it adds a little bit more infrastructure here. But the important thing is still the configuration file. And there's only some slight differences here. The most important thing is that we're saying that for routes that start with MFA/MFA, we're going to forward to /MFA. That means that Zuul itself, where Spring Boot is running, is going to handle those paths. For all other paths, we're going to do just what we did before. We're going to go to localhost 8080. So in this scenario, again, login is out of the box from Stormpath. Once we log in, what's going to happen is we're going to start getting redirected around to the MFA flow. And what this definition is saying is that Zuul itself is going to handle that. So this is kind of a nice civilized configuration file here that allows you to define routes and how different routes are going to be handled. So let me just fire this up, and I'll show you what's going on here. I also have the more verbose log file going on here. Okay, so now let's just log out, and we'll start from the top. Okay, So same thing as before, right? Everything is locked down by default. As soon as I hit the front door, I immediately get redirected to the login. Okay, now this is a little bit different. Notice the URL up in the top here, /MFA setup, so we know, because we just looked at the configuration, that Zuul is returning this page to us. Now, end users have no knowledge of this, and it's one of the powerful things about Zuul is that, it can handle some collection of routes internally. Other routes it can, send off to one microservice. Other routes it can send off to another microservice. Your end users are never the wiser. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to give it a name. We'll call it KCSUG, and I'm going to create a Google Authenticator factor. And now here is my handy-dandy QR code. And what I'm going to do here is use my app, and I'm going to scan in that code. All right, and now let's see if I can... I have never done this before, so let's see if this actually works. Can you all see that? It'll be backwards, right? But at the bottom there, it's backwards. That's the one that I just scanned in. So it has the name that I gave it, and it's got another stuff. If you want to break into my accounts, you have a minute to do so. You got to read the numbers backwards. But what I can do now is I can put in the latest code that I get here, 457231, and now it tells me that, that I was successful, right? Now again, this is an MFA route, so this is being handled by Zuul. If I go back to my default route, now this is forwarding to Juiser, right? So one of the things to notice is, first of all, I didn't restart Juiser. I didn't change any Juiser config. One of the benefits here is this separation of concerns. Juicer's just doing its thing. It's going to get this X-forwarded user header and deal with it. How it gets there, Juicer doesn't care about. As long as it's present, it will deal with it. So once again, I am, Juicer knows who I am. Now, if I log out and log in again, this time, it knows that I've already registered my factor, my multi-factor device, and it's saying, okay, so for this factor that you named KCSUG, put in the latest code. If I put in a bad code, it tells me it's a bad code. As soon as I put in the right code, then I get to go forward again. So for me, this was a little thought experiment in, and this is something that our own customers have asked of us. Like, we don't want to be adding Stormpath dependencies or any other, Octo or Auth2. We don't want to be adding these dependencies to, our 10 microservices. We want to push that out to the Zulu Gateway. So this little example started its life as a Spring Boot example with Stormpath. And I don't know, I would say I spent maybe 2 hours, maybe less, just taking that code and Zulifying it, if you will. And there really wasn't a lot to change. So whether you're using Stormpath or some other provider, you might find yourself wanting to use an edge service, a gateway service like Zuul to kind of push that responsibility out. And it really allows you to keep the focus of the app that you're building on the core business logic. And the one, shim that you're going to need in that app that you're building is just the logic to deal with this assertion. But that's very lightweight. That's a JWT parser as opposed to, like a whole authentication system built into the app itself. So the last thing I'll show you really quick here is just a little bit of some of the code. And let me just jump into the service, because that's where some of the more relevant code is. So just as a for instance here, the whole point of the Java SDK and the integrations is to make your life easier as a developer in working with these things. So if you were going to implement, say Google Authenticator from scratch, that might be like a serious undertaking. In this case, we're dealing with factors and challenges in the Java SDK, and that's hooked up to the Stormpath backend, where we do things like expose the QR code so that you can expose that easily on the page. And in fact, let me just show you that one really quick, because that is probably a more valuable example. So here's my little MFA controller, and if we look over here, I'm just trying to find the place where it actually puts the, oh, here we go. Where it actually puts the QR code in. Here we go. Okay. So in the setup, if, we create a Google Authenticator using the account, right, because the user has logged in at this point, we know who they are, and the factor is always associated with the user, and we're adding this get base 64 QR image, I'm adding to the model, right? So I don't have to worry about how that QR code was created, where it lives. It's just a method call that we expose so that you can easily show the QR code. And if we look at the template here, and I think it's on setup, this again is a time leaf template, and where is my, oh no, what's the name? Here it is, right? So if there's a QR code in the model, then it's going to show the QR code. And this is one of the nice things about just regular old HTML, is that I can give this QR code, if you notice back from my code here, it's a base 64 QR, it's a base 64 representation of that QR code. So it's just, if we were to look at it, it's just a string, right? But regular old HTML can deal with that if we give it this data image PNG base 64. So there isn't even anything special that I have to do here. The way that we see that on the screen is just by having this in our source, followed by the actual base 64 encoded string, and then it just renders on the browser for us. So I just wanted to share that little bit of code with you to show you that it makes life pretty easy. So, any questions about anything Zuul, Juicer, Jot, MFA related, or anything else? I am happy to answer, and we'll make sure that we post all this on the meetup. We'll work with Rob, but these are some of the references. So the JJWT project is where the Java JWT library lives. It's open source. It was written by us at Stormpath, mainly by Les, but myself and other people have contributed to it, but it's its own organization. It's got over 1,000 stars on GitHub, so there are other Java JWT libraries out there, but I think it's fair to say this one is among the more popular. And then just as a side note here, jwtinspector.io, that was where you could pop in a JWT and it would show you what was inside it. There's also the java.jwtinspector.io variant of that is specific to Java. So thank you. Any questions? Hit me. Yeah, sure. So one of the reasons that we wrote Juicer was, so that we didn't set you out on your own without being able to ingest this incoming assertion, right? So this is the configuration on the Juicer side of things, and the only thing that it needs to know out of the box is how to validate that incoming assertion. Everything is configurable, but it has sensible defaults. So for instance, the header name is x forwarded user, and that conforms to the x-forwarded conforms to kind of the de facto standard of, anything that's a forwarded header will not end up showing in the browser. It's used for, if you've ever used like an SSL terminator and you've had like x-forwarded proto and x-forwarded, what's the other one? I forget. Scheme, right? So this conforms to that. And so by default, if you don't override it, really the only thing that you need is a reference to the public key that it's going to use to verify the signature. Yeah, that's exactly right. So if we look at the POM file here, the important dependency is this Juiser Spring Boot starter, right? And then if you take a look here, given that you can then just auto-wire to a user. And so all of the operation of verifying the signature, parsing the claims, creating the user, all of that's hidden underneath all the Spring Boot goodness, and all you have to do is auto-wire a user. Yeah. Yeah.
How would you specify that when you hit a certain controller that MFA is required? Right? I mean, could you have one controller that just standardizes into the client and another controller that MFA is required?
Yeah, you could. This was something that I put together in the Spring Boot version very quickly, and then, moving it over to Zuul even quicker. I did it taking advantage of one of the features that we have with Stormpath is this idea of a login post handler. So that's what I did in this case. Every time you log in, this login post handler gets hit, and so right here it's going to say it's getting this post login MFA endpoint, and it's going to redirect to that endpoint. And what that endpoint is hidden inside the service, and that's just basically determining, has this person already set up MFA or have they not? So you'll either go to MFA setup or MFA confirm. Either way, this login post handler is getting hit every time. I was talking to Matt earlier, and both in the context of Zuul and Spring Boot, it would probably make more sense to implement this whole MFA thing as a filter, and then it can really be like in one spot. Right now, some of these MFA service calls are in a couple of different places in the project, and that may not be totally necessary. But since we had this login post handler facility with Stormpath, and since I wanted this particular flow to be, every time you log in, you must also put in the MFA code, it was kind of a natural fit to just stick it there. Yeah, hit me. It does. Stormpath has another service called ID Site, which is basically a hosted set of views that are customizable. Like the views that you saw in this example, those were coming from Spring Boot or from Zuul. If you're using our single sign-on service, it would be those views would be hosted at ID Site, and they're, we expect that you would be customizing them, skinning them to look and feel like your own website. But the point is that when you're using ID Site, when you go to authenticate, you get redirected to ID Site, and then you get redirected back, and so you can achieve single sign-on because those cookies are going to be presented, because of the redirects, right? So, and it's all white labeled. Where it redirects to is your own domain that you configure. So your customers would never have any idea that Stormpath was in the mix. It would all be your own domain. But short answer is yes. We have a single sign-on service. Any other questions? Well, I just want to say thank you to Rob for inviting us. Thank you for having us. Thank you for your time and attention. And I'll be around for a few minutes after. I do have to scoot. I'm not going to join you guys at the bar after. Lee and I have to catch up on some stuff. But Matt will be with you guys. And we're easy to reach. So thanks.